So today we'll be looking at Daniel chapter 3 and very probably chapter 4 as well. Both of these we'll read some longer sections because chapter 3 is just one self-contained story, and then chapter 4 really is something that is best read all in one reading as well. And then we'll try to go back and pick apart some of the details in those. And if we don't finish it, we don't finish it. We know we have plenty of time to catch up on those things. But especially with chapter 3, I think the points to take away are pretty obvious there. So we'll try to let the text speak to us. And if we have questions, if we have places that we really want to chase down some details, we can do that. So why don't we open with a prayer, and then we'll read chapter 3. But let's begin with prayer. Dear Lord Jesus, we ask that you would bless our time together, help us to grow in our understanding and our knowledge, that you would open our minds and our hearts, and that you would grow our faith through these things that we read, so that we may demonstrate a faith that is strong, just like your servants, the Hebrews who were in exile, did at this time in the book of Daniel that we are reading. In your name we pray. Amen. So let's get right into it. We'll start at chapter 3, verse 1. And like I said, we'll read all the way to the end of this chapter to get the whole story down. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was the hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So probably a familiar story. I know it's one that's pretty commonly taught in Sunday school years, but maybe been a while since you've looked through it and read it in all of its detail. So let's take a look at some of those details. First of all, in the very first verses of this chapter, we hear quite a bit about this statue that Nebuchadnezzar set up. We hear about its size, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, and we hear about where it's set up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon, and then that all these officials were required to come to it. When you hear something like that, that's really specific in detail, real precise about what this looked like, and then probably even more so like where it was. What are the details like that tell us? What kind of information does that give us, or what kind of purpose does that serve?
It's a very arrogant man.
Yeah, so when you hear about the statue and about everything you want to do, again, it tells us a little bit about the character of Nebuchadnezzar, doesn't it? What else do specific details like that do for us in an account like this?
Well, it's not like they made it up. I mean, when you give really specific details like that, it makes it more historical and factual.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I was getting at. But certainly, in the details themselves, we learn a lot about the people who are involved with it. It makes the story more vivid for us. But then also, right, it's not like it's made up. It's talking about real places. It's giving real details as if it was being reported in the time that it happened, because it was. I mean, people who want to dispute it always can and always will. But for those of us who first are believing it by faith, there's also a lot of evidence there to back up the things that we're believing and teaching. And certainly, again, we've gotten to know a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar in chapters 1, chapter 2, and here again, we see, despite the fact that he's encountered some humbling situations, he is nonetheless still extremely arrogant. When we get into chapter 4, we'll see even more about what Nebuchadnezzar learns about God. But good. First, so that's question 1. Question 2. What does the list of officials in verse 2, and then it gets repeated a couple times, what does that list of officials tell you about Babylonian society?
Structured.
Yeah, it's very structured. And I think sometimes we can get this this idea about ancient cultures and civilizations that because they didn't have the technology that we have, and we're so far separated from them in time and in experience, that they were somehow less of a society. They were different in the way they were set up, but they were still quite organized and structured societies, these empires of old, these nations of old. And sometimes to realize that, and then to understand the things that are going on in the lives of God's people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, can one help us understand that it wasn't just, oh, here were these primitive people with their gods, and they were with these other primitive tribe kind of people. No, there was real society. So again, kind of going to the details and the truthfulness of what we're reading, but then also when we're making application to ourselves, we can look at this and say, they lived in a society that, though it was thousands of years before ours, it worked in very much the same way that our society does. We've got these levels of structure, and you've got, the secular world and being involved with it. We said that's a big theme of this book, of how God's people interact with the secular world. And when we take a look at that, that's a good application for us. Yeah,
I
Karen.
remember one time a pastor explaining that older societies they couldn't communicate as fast as we can today, but that was the main difference.
Yeah, and in many ways, I think that's a good way to put it. Because you do hear about that, like something happened there, and yet it's pretty remarkable too. Sometimes when you hear about, like these, ancient battles and the messengers whom they ran and they did these, and so words still to get about. But yeah, even as much as 200 years ago, when the United States was a young country, the speed of communication was slower. Otherwise, there was still structure then. Tom.
It's highly structured, and so is our society, but there's one big difference. I mean, we still largely follow the rule of law rather than the rule of men. And you see what Nebuchadnezzar was able to be totally arbitrary. He'd make up, decrees to throw people into furnaces, and decrees that you must worship, this god. There's a note in the study Bible that the statue was probably to the god Nabu, and Nabu is the first element of Nebuchadnezzar's name, so he probably looked at himself as divine or possessing divine authority. And whatever he said went, all of these officials all down the structure had to follow his every whim.
Sure. Yeah. And no doubt you're correct with that, and with what the note's saying, that there was, we've heard already that there was a spiritual aspect to Babylonian culture, and it was present with their nobility as well. And that was something that persisted up until the times of the Romans, and in certain factors, and even beyond, where they thought that they were gods or appointed by the gods. In our day, I think you could say that it's of some of the more powerful and like oppressive dictator type rulers in the world, that even if they maybe don't believe in God or have the same sort of structured religion like these ancient peoples did, that the way they act and think is not that far removed from thinking that they are God. So another good thing to point out, and again, once we get into chapter 4, which is another reason why it's good to take these two together, we see some of the contrast between what Nebuchadnezzar thinks about himself and what true God has to say. Anything else on the list of officials or on Babylonian society? Question 3, how did Nebuchadnezzar find out that these 3 Jews were not worshiping the image?
The astrologers ratted them out.
Yeah, they got ratted out. So we see a little bit of that religious persecution going on. One of the things I was reading this week in preparation for this mentioned that the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar specifically did not persecute the Jews or other people that had their religion, their own religions. We shouldn't get the wrong idea that here, like in some other times, there was this specific persecution against them. By and large, as long as you were obeying the king and doing whatever the king wanted you to do, you could do your other stuff. They didn't really care about it. But we do see here, nonetheless, that even in a situation where religious freedom, and as we might term it, is pretty free, there's always going to be those who have it out for true worshipers of God. They get ratted out by some of these other astrologers, no doubt. There's so many reasons, and we're not told exactly why, but whether it was jealousy because they had been treated well before, if you remember the end of chapter 2, these guys got promoted, or maybe it's just they saw an opportunity where, hey, something's going on that's bad, and we get a chance to get ahead. Nonetheless, like I said, always, even during good times where there's not real outward persecution, there will be those enemies. Question 4. Why might it be a little surprising that Nebuchadnezzar reacts the way he does to the report of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not worshiping his gods or the image he set up?
We had just learned in chapter 2 that God came through for Daniel, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tied in with that. And so, in 2 verse 47, he says, Nebuchadnezzar said, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. So he just, and I say just, I don't know the time between.
Sure, yeah.
He put Shadrach, Meshach, and a part of his reward for them having a God that supported them and came through for them when they needed it, as he always does, was that he put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into their position as administrators over the province of Babylon. So,
Right.
it wasn't like these guys were not familiar to him.
Yeah. And you do well to point out that we don't exactly know what the timeline is, but nonetheless.
Right, because he just had that dream about the idol, and so then we just had a dream about an idol that broke up and fell down. So let's go ahead and build an idol.
Right. But nonetheless, he knew who these guys were and what they were, what they were about. He would have known, about their worship. So it's a little surprising on that hand, and especially it would be surprising if we do take this as chronologically following after, regardless of how much time spans in between it, that he would do that. But now, on the other hand, let's think about why he might. I hesitate to say have good reason, because we're not going to say his reasons are good, but understandable reasons that he might be surprised by their actions. Why might he be expected to be surprised that they?
He's been good to them.
Yeah, so he's been good to them.
Promoted them. You give him money. He expects reciprocation.
Yeah, so I think that's one good thing. I think maybe we could think some other things as well. Terry?
I think he expected everyone to obey his every whim without question. So that's part of it. And then he questioned them the consequences, and spelled it out, and yes, and no, we're not going to defend our actions. We don't have to.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it.
Yeah. Tom?
Well, Daniel and those 3 guys up to the point before this, things they had done were in line with things that Nebuchadnezzar wanted. It was a dream. So they helped him out and had never opposed him on anything. So this is the first time he's getting opposition from people that have been helpful to him.
Yeah. And if we want to add one more thing, I think we can say this. He's a polytheist. So for him to worship, his own gods, and then to acknowledge someone else's gods and to acknowledge someone else's gods is not really a big deal. So we take all these things that we say, we put them together, and from a human perspective, we can understand why he'd be a little surprised, right? First of all, I'm not asking you to do this terrible thing to just acknowledge one more set of gods. And anyway, I'm the king, and I've been good to you, and I'm not used to people standing up to me. All those things come into play, and you can understand why he would be a little surprised and be a little taken aback by it.
I mean, it's more than taken aback, it's that he was furious with rage.
Yeah, so I should have put this question a little bit earlier, but let's jump to question 7 on the page. What kind of clues about the relationship between these 3 Hebrew men serving as high officials and the king do we get from the phrase, and this phrase is in 19, verse 19, that his attitude toward them changed?
Could be that he thought that they would be useful to him and his plans for whatever he's gonna do, and now they have no use, he has no use for them.
Yeah. So going off of what Tom said, and then what Terry just said for us, like he does initially act, furious with rage, like that there would be someone who's not doing this, and we say, well, maybe we're a little surprised by his reaction, and at the same time we understand some of his reasons for it. But he does give them a second chance, and we see that he's furious with rage, but he still asks them, is it true? And then he gives them again what the consequence is going to be. But then when they really finally do stand up to him with their words in his presence, well, then he's done. And whatever use they are to him, whatever use they might have been, whatever kind of positive relationship they may have had because he had already promoted them, that's gone. And the rage boils over the top. So those little clues there show us that, it's maybe a little surprising that he reacts the way he does. But in the end, what wins out? It's his ego and his anger that rules the day. Just a couple things connected there with Nebuchadnezzar. Now let's take a look at these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or their Hebrew names. Was it Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? What is important to note about the faith that these 3 men displayed in their answer? And if we want to take a look again to refresh ourselves as to what they say, it starts in verse 16. O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So what are the important things to note in their statement of faith? Tom?
Well, when they said he is able to rescue us, but even if he does not, they're very cognizant of God's will. They're really saying, if God wills it, but if he doesn't, that's okay too. So they're paying attention. They just don't expect things God to do. They expect him to do things according to his will, not theirs.
Yeah, exactly. They don't demand a miracle from God, but they trust that if God wants to, he can do the miracle. Yeah, so that's one big thing, certainly. Probably the biggest one there.
They're in touch with the eternal consequences of if they eat that degraded or awful foods that have been offered unto idols, which God commanded we can't consume. They know the consequence would outweigh the benefit of the favor of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, to compromise their trust and worship of God, their faith in him, their loyalty to him, whatever word you want to insert there, has an eternal consequence that is far more severe than any temporal benefit they would receive in return, like their lives or anything else along with that. Yeah. Anything else that you notice about what they said?
I would say when they say, "Oh Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter," they are pretty much saying, our God comes before you. So they're showing that he, you may be the king, but God is over you.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, when I read those words, to me, it's like a kind of a different way of stating what Peter and John said. We must obey God rather than men. We don't defend ourselves before the Jewish hierarchy. And here, these three guys didn't see the need to defend themselves to a king of Nebuchadnezzar's.
Yeah. So I wanted to look a little bit more at those words. We do not need to defend ourselves before you. And the question I asked, which maybe isn't the greatest question, but it at least allows us to think about it a little bit longer. What lesson can we learn from the way that they say, we don't need to defend ourselves before you? And I think we've touched on some of the things already, but what else might we say about that, Terry?
Well, because God judges the heart, and He is the one that has that ultimate authority, and our lives are under Him, and that's what we need to think, not what we need to do to us as concept, but
Yeah.
what God can do to us eternally.
Yeah. Tom, you
It's
have
easy
something else?
to fall into a trap when dealing with people who really disagree with you on something. They come back and they start charging you with things, and the argument now goes, you're trying to justify yourselves before them instead of justifying what God has said.
Yeah. Yeah, and you highlight a key distinction in the words that we use. There's a difference between defending or justifying yourself as opposed to testifying and witnessing. And there's no need to defend or justify ourselves or God for that matter, because like we said, God is God, and He is the judge, and He knows what's in people's hearts, and He will do what is right, what is according to His will. On the other hand, to testify, to witness, to speak the truth, that's a different thing. And I'm sorry, I don't remember who said it, but with the apostles, I think it must have been you, Tom, right? Same kind of thing. When they were before people, they didn't, try to justify themselves or try to, in any way defend God, but they simply spoke the truth and then said, you got to do what you got to do, and I've got to obey God. Because again, the eternal consequence, not just for myself, but for everyone who's hearing me, is far more important than anything else. Tom?
And if you're not alert to that when it comes up and fall for it, what you've done is you're now testifying or debating, whatever you would call it, according to that person's rules, not God's rules, not what God wants you to do.
Yeah. Anything else so far in what we've discussed? So we talked about question 7 already. Question 8. So we jump ahead to where these men were saved. And I guess I could just talk a little bit about the nature of this furnace. So my understanding from what I was researching is that if you can picture in your mind kind of like a big kiln type of furnace, if you've ever seen things that like for clay and that, so it's kind of your domed thing. Think of that on a larger scale is what they say is kind of what it would be like. So like an area at the bottom to stoke the fire, to feed the fire, and then an opening at the top. And that would have been most likely where these men, they're thrown in, and then you still would have been able to see from these areas, either from a vantage point above or from looking into the opening where you can tend to the fire. Of course, just some of the details that we get there, it's pretty straightforward. He gets mad. He wants this fire even hotter, as if, a hot fire wasn't going to kill them already. He wants to make sure he kills them dead, you might say. It overtakes the soldiers who threw them in there. And then, of course, the details, they don't get killed. Though they were firmly tied and bound when they were thrown in, they walked about freely when the angel was in there with them. And then just seeing that there was another person there. And also, interesting to note, I don't know if there's necessarily anything real important about it, but they don't get in and then as soon as they're free, try to scramble out. They're, whatever was going on there in there, whether they're conversing with the angel of God or whether they were just, told to wait until they were given permission to leave. It is an interesting thing. And what it does is it makes it absolutely certain that there's something divine going on here, as opposed to just, it was a freak accident, they didn't die, and now they're free and they scrambled out.
Actually, when I read that, I thought why did they come out? They're hanging out with angels. Why, when he said come out, did they come out? I'd be like, just a minute, I'm gonna talk to this guy a little bit longer.
Right. And it's kind of interesting too, because most of the times when someone sees an angel, and obviously this angel would look glorious as they do that, there's a frightening reaction even from the person. And here first of all, we don't hear anything about it because that's not really the point. But Nebuchadnezzar sees what this being looks like, and he's startled by it. But yeah, that's questions that we can't really answer, but it is kind of curious. Anything else about those details before we talk about their deliverance? Tom?
When we talked about Nebuchadnezzar being furious with rage, he made that fire so much hotter that it killed some of his own soldiers, which to him was probably not a big deal. But it just really illustrates how operating from real anger, people don't make good decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty irrational. Like I said, the furnace was going to kill them already without making it hotter. So now, talking about the fact, we understand that they were delivered by God. It was absolutely and clearly an act of God. And what did God demonstrate by delivering these men? Because as we know, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their confession stated, God would have remained God had he delivered them physically or not. But what did God demonstrate by delivering them?
Protection.
Yeah, so protection, in terms of what he testified about how he cares about his people. Terry?
I think also he was protecting his reputation because the king was telling the people to worship this image. And, these three, we're going to worship our God, our God only. They were protecting his name, if you will. And so God was, protecting his name and reputation.
Demonstrating who he really was.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to come back to that, but I want to let some other answers go. So John
He's
is
also showing how powerful he was.
Yeah, his power certainly on display. And Nebuchadnezzar, no other god could save in this way, because no other idol had ever in the history of man demonstrated that they could give this kind of rescuing. No doubt, in battle, maybe someone escapes and they wouldn't have expected it. They could say, "Oh, our gods did this," but no one's ever seen where it's absolute, you're going to die, and then God miraculously saves, because only God is a real God. Tom, did you have something too?
Well, God intervenes in affairs according to his will, not ours. But when he does, he saves people like this. It's you see his mercy in action. It wasn't his, even if he had allowed them to be burned up, that's not really something that would make him happy. That's not his pleasure, is in being merciful to people. Why he does intervene sometimes and not others, I guess when we meet it face to face, we'll have to ask him that question.
Yeah.
I guess
Karen?
today I would say, well, that was God's grace,
Yeah,
depending on the situation. That was God's grace.
definitely. It's a comfort in many ways. One, that he would show his grace and mercy to these people, that he does care about his people and will protect them. But I think those things, we can even wrap those up in the big thing of God is defending himself, not just demonstrating his power, but who he is as God. Because he's the one who created the world, made man, saved man from whatever ills there might have been. And then specifically, because this was literature for Israel, right? Literature for believers, then down the line, that even though his people were in exile, God didn't lose control. In fact, they were in exile because God put them there. And even though they're in exile, God is still their God. He's still the God of their salvation. And again, expanding it now out of Israel and the perspective of an Old Testament believer to the perspective of a New Testament believer, he is the God that saves, that's compassionate, that's long-suffering. So all those things are tied up in, first of all, who God is, because everything that God does is more than just an action of his or a characteristic of him. It is who he is. That's his name. I am who I am. And everything about him is who he is. And he makes that extremely clear by this, that Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's great. Babylon may seem great. Israelites, you may seem like God isn't strong to save. But none of that is true. God is still exactly who he always was. It's people who change their actions. Terry.
I also think, practical application for these days, end times, that when bad things happen and people think, why did this happen? God could deliver me, but he didn't. But then looking at it from that other angle, well, God's grace, as Karen said, he's compassionate and he's loving, and there are still more to be saved, which is why we're still here, still witnessing for Jesus. So
Yeah, that's a good point as well. Definitely. Anything else? Yeah.
I think part of the powerful thing too is that he doesn't do things halfway. I mean, you hear about how they were dressed in their trousers and turbans and other clothes, and yet not a hair was singed, not a scorch on any of the clothes. They didn't even smell like fire.
Yeah, and those are not details to overlook, because there can be no mistake about it. God intervened. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't some crazy freak incident where this happens 1 out of 100 billion times that this could happen. No, it was God. They were tied up. They were wearing as many of their clothes as they would have ever been wearing at any time. They were as flammable could be, and they came out with not a single hair of their head singed. And you see that too, everyone gathers around them, all these other officials who were in the area, and they're checking this out and they're looking. Not even the slightest indication that there was harm done to them. Tom.
I think it's interesting to note that, Daniel and these 3 guys, they did some good things for Nebuchadnezzar, impressed him with being able to interpret the dream. He praised their God. They oppose him, he turns against them. Another miracle happens, and now he testifies to God's greatness. It kind of reminded me of Jesus' ministry. He was confronted often with people. If he didn't do miracles that they expected, they turned away from him. Did a miracle, then they gathered around him, and you see the same thing going on here. The miraculous happens, and ooh, I better praise this God. And then it's soon forgotten about.
Yeah. That's a good point to make, especially this month of what our gospel readings are going to be, all from John chapter 6. And John 6 starts out with Jesus feeding the 5,000. And then the rest of John 6 is Jesus, it's often called the discourse on the bread of life. He says, they were eating this bread and they wanted more. They wanted to follow him, not because even so much they had seen miracles, but because they got fed. And then he says, instead, you should want bread of life. I am the bread of life. My flesh is the bread of life. And then what do we hear at the end? Well, a lot of people were upset. Some of those who had been following for quite a long time leave him. And so it's like what the point you were making, Tom, about the miracles. In the end, the miracles don't save or create saving faith, but they show who God is. With Jesus, they show who Jesus is, and he is God. So a good tie-in to Jesus and to what we're coming up on. Well, let's talk about the last question then on chapter 3, and maybe we'll have to hold off on chapter 4 because we won't get through all of it. If you had to come up with a theme or let's say a lesson to summarize chapter 3, what would it be? You got to capture it in one or two sentences.
God's fidelity is certainly there, but to tap into it, following his advice or his will, what he's requiring. It doesn't mean you'll cash in on following instructions, but so there he asked them to not eat the defiled meat, and they were rewarded. Simply following God's instructions.
Yeah, so I suppose you could make the connection between God's faithfulness and living out our faith. And of course, I think we're going to circle back then to the fact that it's grace in the first place that we have a faith. But to understand how important it is to remain in that faith, that would be something that we want to pray for, and that we would want to stay close to the word and the sacraments, which is what strengthens the faith, because we see how important it is on a grand scale when we have eternity and what might confront us in time. So yeah, I got one good thought. Terry?
Just, this is very simplistic, but,
Mhm.
First commandment, don't set any image ahead of God. God's the most important. It is important to God that He is the most important thing in our life. He is the one, and that the story encapsulates that whole
Yeah.
feeling that it is important to Him that we put Him first and don't put anything in front of Him or get in the way of that.
Yeah, I like that. A story that shows you God's serious about the first commandment. And not in a negative way, because you could say, you could have a story of where God punishes someone for, say, blasphemy or something. You could say, well, God's serious about the first commandment. But here's kind of the positive side of it. John, did you have your hand
That's
up?
what I was gonna say, God is in control
Sure.
all the way through it.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a comforting thing too for, again, as people who live in a secular society like Daniel did, like these other three Hebrews did, despite the fact that, at the end of it and even before, they enjoyed freedom to worship the true God. And there were other people who worshiped the true God, that God was in control from beginning to end. Even when he didn't look like he might be, even when they were tested to think that they were being abandoned, they weren't, and they didn't fail, or they didn't think that they were being abandoned. Anything else on chapter 3? All right. Well, we still do have 15 minutes. So let's see if we can't just read through chapter 4 and then, Tom?
I was gonna say, I just thought of something over in the New Testament. We're told that where 2 or 3 are gathered, Jesus is with them. Well, based on Daniel, you could also rephrase and say where 2 or 3 are gathered in the fiery furnace, God is with them.
Suppose so. Doesn't matter where you're located, right? So like I was saying, for chapter 4, we won't be able to discuss it, but rather than just give up on the remaining time that we have, let's read through the chapter, and we'll read it again when we gather together next week. But you'll have the questions to look at, and those will be the same questions that we'll have next time. So maybe it'll give you a chance to think a little bit more deeply on some of those questions, and then when you come back, you'll have all the answers. No, but it will give you a little extra time to dwell on what is kind of an interesting story. There's some little details, and maybe what it'll give you as well is an opportunity to see what questions I was going to have us discuss, and then if there are things there that you don't see, you can come with your own questions. So I will have handouts next week, but if you do want to hold on to this one, maybe it'll be a good way for us to expand on our discussion next week. But let's read through all of chapter 4. It is a little long and it'll probably bring us close to the end of our time. So chapter 4, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in my bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream, interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying in my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the beasts of the field found shelter, and the birds of the air lived in its branches. From it, every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in my bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Excuse me. Thank you. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets them over the lowliest of men. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me. But you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the beasts of the field, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds of the air. You, O king, are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. You, O king, saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, Cut down the tree and destroy it. But leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live like the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from your people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold him back, can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So like I said, a very interesting section, a lot going on in there. Maybe just a couple questions since we do have some more time. First of all, from whose perspective, for the most part, is this chapter told? Yeah, it's from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. So right away, that's one of the most interesting things about it, is that chapters 1 through 3, we would assume it's all just from Daniel as either an observer or as the one who heard reports of these things and recording it as a writer, who maybe has more details than just an eyewitness obviously would have. But nonetheless, now chapter 4 and those who are knowledgeable about these things will say it takes on the form of an inscription or a declaration from a king. That he starts out. His official title there, and it's to the peoples, the nations, everywhere. You get that greeting in there, may you prosper, and then he goes into the heart of it. The follow-up question to that, when does it appear that this was written relative to the events that are contained in it?
I say it was written after he saw a lot of the miracles.
Yeah. And what things stand out that make it seem that it would have to be all after it?
But it's still praising God.
Yeah. So first of all, we know it's not during the time of his insanity. That would be pretty obvious. But it would seem that all of this would come because he's saying, I'm praising God right off the bat because here's what happened to me. I had this dream. The dream was told to me. The dream came true. And then just like the dream said also, I was restored at the end. And here's now coming out the other side what I have to say. Terry?
It can also show us the patience of God, because Nebuchadnezzar had the opportunity to see God at work in 3 different instances, and still he put himself above, thinking he was above that. But then at the end of this, he definitely puts God first. I don't know if he let go of the other guys, but he did put God first.
Yeah. Yeah, so we do have some more time, so let's just try to go through these questions here. What do you notice, first of all, about how Nebuchadnezzar talks about Daniel versus how Daniel talks about himself back when he came to the king in chapter 2? So you might have to turn back and refresh yourself on how Daniel approaches him when he interprets the dream, starting at verse 24 of chapter 2 and following.
You know,
John?
Daniel's got to interpret the dream.
Yeah, so he knows about Daniel's ability and that there's divine power with him, I guess you maybe could say.
Daniel gives all credit to the one true God. You know, chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar says, I know that the spirit of the holy gods, plural, is in you. So he's, it's not exactly the same attribution.
So first of all, it's just a matter too of Daniel takes none of the credit. Whoops. And with Nebuchadnezzar, he's attributing some of this specialness to Daniel, where Daniel, he says, I'm not special. I've experienced grace. If we want to use that word again. And then too, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't make it clear that this is the God who's doing it. He has some divine power. He even says, where is it? Yeah, verse 8. He is called Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. So he talks about his, false god. And then right after that, he talks about the spirits of the gods being with Daniel. So there's no clear delineation between which spirits of the gods exactly are with Daniel. And this even after the fact of all this happening, he's still pretty obviously polytheistic. Why would Daniel's thoughts about the dream terrify him? We hear that in that intervening part right before he goes ahead and interprets it. Tom?
Well, Daniel was human. He might have, he knew what this meant for Nebuchadnezzar. This is bad news. And now he has to get bad news to the king who just threw 3 of his friends into a furnace.
Right.
So from a human standpoint, he would be really concerned and terrified about what he had to tell King Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. And you see the tactful way in which he brings the bad news to him. If only this was about your enemies and about your adversaries. But and he's like, you became this great tree, and you're so big that your kingdom stretches to the sky, and all the peoples are under you. But God's gonna cut you down. He's got to tell the truth, but he does present it in a very tactful manner. Question 13. What lesson had Nebuchadnezzar failed to learn despite his previous encounters with the Hebrews in his service?
There's only one true God.
Yeah. And it still would seem like he failed to learn that at the end, but at least he was finally elevating God to the degree that he needed to acknowledge God. But again, we saw what happened with the 3 men in the fiery furnace. We saw what happened the first time Daniel interpreted a dream for him. He even would have gotten a hint at it when the men were presented to him, and they were acting differently. So the stubbornness of his heart is evident, and it takes something pretty extreme even to get him to acknowledge God to the degree that he does. Following up with that, then, is there any indication that true conversion occurred? And of course, I'm not asking you to read Nebuchadnezzar's heart, because that's impossible. But how would you react to what he says and what you hear about him doing?
Well, that verse, the last verse, that verse 37 is quite a testimony of what he believes.
Sure. Yeah, he does. I mean, he does say, "I praise, exalt, and glorify the King of Heaven, because everything he does is right, and his ways are just."
And those who walk right, he's able to humble.
Yeah, Tom, follow up.
Well, on the other hand, in verse 30, 34, and 35, his dominion is eternal, seen and endures generation to generation. You know, that sounds like words we would say, but then all the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases. That to me sounds like somebody who thinks of the gods like the Greeks and Romans did, that the gods could be very arbitrary and they didn't really care about that people, all the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. That was the height of God's creation. And he loved the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, again, when we're taking it at the perspective of here, at least from his beginnings, was a completely pagan man. So there's some credence to the way that he would talk about that. But at the same time, I think there's language, say like in the Psalms, for example, where it's similar to that. Like God, when it comes to what you do and what's going on earth, like no one influences you. You can crush people if you want. There is similar kind of language. But again, we do have to understand who it's coming from. Ultimately, we're going to come down on the fact that we can't say. I mean, it's very clear that he still at least holds on to some idea of other gods and of, what his picture of spirituality is. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't, have truly now put his trust in God. But you'd also have to wonder, like, just from learning about God's power and authority, does not necessarily teach him about God's redemptive and saving work. Terry and then Tom.
Isn't this also true of any new believer? You are who you are at the time God meets you, and you learn through His Word and through prayer and discovering who God is through that relationship that God changed you. So it doesn't mean that he wasn't a believer. It just means maybe he was a new believer, but yet, because as a pagan, how can he say things of God if it's not of God? I guess.
Yeah, I'll come back to that, but I want to get to it, Tom.
Well, something similar to what Terry said is, maybe he does have faith in God, but he's got a weak faith. It needs strengthening. He needs sanctification over a period of time to get rid of some of the other baggage that he still carries with him.
Yeah. Vicky.
Yeah, and to me, it seems like he had so much pride, and you could see him humbling himself by what God was doing to him. And I think that's a really good testimony of being so prideful, but able to humble yourself.
Yeah. So to bring it back now full circle, the question is kind of a dangerous one in some ways, and it's not really one that's necessarily worth pursuing to an end, right? Where you have to come down on one side or the other. But what it does do, and what it did do for us in discussion, was allow us to identify some important things, and among them is certainly the fact that if you did have faith, it was the weak faith of a new Christian who still had those other things getting in the way, and to realize and identify that because they do stand out as being false ideas, false beliefs, that there is an importance to work on getting rid of those and to strengthen the trust in God. But of course, I mean, the way he talks about God, and God does use, unbelievers to speak truths about himself in the Bible. We do hear that. So that can't be a 100% indication in one way. Also, the fact that just because he speaks truth about God. But we're kind of left with this last lesson where ultimately for us, the importance is not on whether Nebuchadnezzar was a true believer or not, because one, he doesn't tell us, so we don't know that on that front. That's not the point of what we're supposed to take away. Two, Nebuchadnezzar is long dead and judged, so it's not like there's anything we can do about it at this point. And three, that what we do see nonetheless are the truths that Nebuchadnezzar says about how God operates, who he is, what he knows about him, and what he does to the proud. And that's the last thing we hear from Nebuchadnezzar. I was trying to look, I can't remember, I can't recall off the top of my head if any of Daniel's dreams that come later in the book go back to the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But even if they do, the dreams are more just a self-contained thing. And we never, again, hear from Nebuchadnezzar or hear anything about him. So it's kind of an interesting way to leave him, especially compared to what kind of a figure he's been in all the other stories so far, that he gets to end on that note. Tom?
Well, I think the possibility that Nebuchadnezzar was brought to faith certainly tells us just how boundless God's grace is, that it could include a guy like this who did the things that he did, building great statues to himself, throwing people in furnaces, and it reminds us that there is no limit to God's grace.
Yeah. And if we wanted to draw a parallel, which is a parallel that we've made before with Daniel and another figure, it was Joseph to Egypt. And then if we want to fast forward a little bit to Moses and Egypt with Pharaoh, we hear at a certain point during the plagues that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And he was judged at that point, but God still had a purpose for using him as a figure on earth at that time. But up until that point where Pharaoh hardened his heart and God said, okay, you're done now, God was still presenting him with opportunity to acknowledge him as true God, and then too to be able to say things like that and perhaps have genuine faith. But there in that case, it's obvious and it is clear what the outcome is. Whereas here it's, again, not entirely clear, but a similar kind of situation. And also just an interesting story that, he goes and he becomes insane more or less and goes and lives and then gets restored to the kingdom. So anything else on that? Where we are at the time, we did manage to get through it. A long section, but maybe not so many details to pick apart. If there are still questions that you have, or if you go away and come up with one before we come back next time, we'll come back to it. But otherwise, expect to start going into chapter 5, where we hear about a different king, a different ruler. We'll talk a little bit about the background and the timing of this, and then, of course, writing on the wall, maybe another story that's familiar from here, but take a look at some of the details. So, let's close with a prayer then. Dear Lord God, we thank you for this time together to spend in your word. We ask that the lessons we have learned, you would plant deeply in our hearts so that we would have a strong faith like the faith of those that we hear about here. We thank you for your grace as well that you show to people who are extremely undeserving, which is what we were, and which is what we are, but you still show your grace day by day. We ask that you would watch over these people in this congregation, give them protection, give them energy to carry out the ministry here, and allow us to celebrate too the fellowship of believers that exists in this place. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
For the